Hey, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I don't know where you are right now, but what I do know is I'm glad you're here with us.
Yeah.
Tonight, we are having an excellent conversation with Pastor Dr. Lewis from the New Faith Church. We're talking about how do we communicate effectively with our senior pastors. Listen, here's the question. Have you ever been in a space where you had something to say, but didn't know if what you were saying was going to be received well? Or maybe you were in a space where you had something to say and you weren't quite sure how to say it. Well, typically that's the relationship between a youth pastor and a senior pastor. And although that is your leader, you aren't quite sure how to say stuff to them or how they'll respond. Tonight, we have an excellent leader who has lived the life of ministry. I mean, he's worked in every aspect. I think at one point he probably was a janitor at a church because he's just done everything that there is to do at a church. And now he is a dynamic senior pastor, does great things with ministry and is helping ministries grow in a season where we're seeing a lot of doors close. So we want to make sure your doors are staying open in youth ministry as you grow and do great things. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we will start our conversation. Father, we thank you for this night, this opportunity for us to join together as ministries to talk about communicating. Father, over and over again, you talk about the power of communication in the Word of God. So God, help us even now to learn how to speak well, not only on platforms in our youth ministries, but to speak well with the people that lead us in our separate ministries. We thank you for this evening. We ask that it be pleasing in your sight. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So without further ado, please welcome Pastor Lewis. Or Pastor Dr. Lewis. Let me put some respect on his name. He earned that.
Man, hey, Will, how you doing, man?
Great.
How's everyone doing? It's a pleasure being with you guys today. Look forward to having some meaningful dialogue in regards to communication and youth ministry across the board.
Yes. Super excited that you're here. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, we created a set of questions because, listen, I like to be organized. I don't want to be in here shooting from the hip, but listen, if you have a question, put it in the chat. You can ask it. Pastor Lewis, can you tell us a little bit about New Faith Church?
New Faith Church was established in 1977 by the Reverend Dr. T.R. Williams. It was a plant that rapidly grew over the next 40 plus years. Dr. Williams established the church, started the church, created a model for ministry in the Hiram Clark area during a time of transition when we saw the historic individuals in the community started leaving, which was predominantly a white community, and African-Americans started coming in, and Dr. Williams came in that influx. And so the church obviously grew tremendously during that season. And so we are now what you call the New Faith Church. As a result of that, he has been the only pastor, and I am the second pastor in the life of the church.
That's major. That's I mean, just to think of the history and the time that's gone into this, and now to serve as the second pastor of this church, this historic church. Well, let's jump right into what we're talking about today. We're talking about youth ministry and how youth pastors can talk to senior pastors. There was a time where you served as a youth pastor. How was it like serving as a youth pastor, and where did you serve?
So first I served in two locations. I served under Harvey Walker. At that time, it was called St. Luke Church. And then they transitioned the name to The Crossing. I started working there full-time youth ministry in 2000. I was part-time prior to that from about 97 to about 2000. Prior to that, I worked at Evangelist Temple Church of God in Christ as a youth director. Started that in about 1994, 95. And then came to New Faith Church in 2005 and started working as the youth pastor. It was a unique experience because all three experiences were different denominational movements. Under Church of God in Christ, obviously there was an extreme strict rule. Speaking in tongues was important. You didn't have a lot of dialogue with the senior pastor. At that time, which was Bishop Kyles at that time. You didn't have a lot of communication with him head on. When I went to St. Luke, I had a lot of conversation with that pastor, Pastor H.M. Walker at the time. but there was a lot of distance or a chasm that exists because it was a family-ran church primarily. It was a upstart. They moved from Sunnyside to the Hiram Clark area. He was the second or third pastor in the life of that church. And then when I came to New Faith, Dr. Williams kind of was a lot more open to hearing and having dialogue about ministry across the board. So I went through three different kind of movements, if you will.
So let's start with the hard question. So you said you went through these different dynamics of ministry. Would you say it's better if the senior pastor is more vocal or less vocal with their youth pastor?
I think it depends on the vision, to be honest with you. And I do think the youth pastor and the senior pastor should be vocal. But in a lot of these settings, they have and you've probably experienced this, and so with some of the callers, they have a model of what they want to see, but they don't know how to get there, and they don't know how to help you to get there. And so what typically happens is they want to see something, but they don't know exactly what they want to see. And what they want to see is always tied to numbers, which creates a whole nother, list of concern and confusion, as a leader. In all three of those areas, numbers seem to trump discipleship. And so numbers for many of them was a source of if the ministry was growing. If you don't have numbers, it's not growing. And so that was a big issue, in all three of those ministries.
Okay. You mentioned that numbers were a big deal, right? Mm-hmm. So in this post-pandemic, or I can't even say post-pandemic because I feel like we're kind of still there a little bit. Mm-hmm. What numbers matter now? Because if we're talking bodies in the seats, well, man, some of them are coming, some of them aren't. And so how does a youth pastor measure success?
I think in this culture, I call it a post-pandemic period only because people are out. They're not wearing masks. They're going to large venues. The church has suffered with attendance, but many church congregations are arguing that their money is good, meaning the financial aspect of the church is moving, but people coming, or we like to say butts and pews, you don't see. So I think the measuring tool has to be both your social media platforms and individuals in pews or individuals in seats. I think that has to be the measuring stick. I think you're going to have individuals who don't come, but they're tuning in. And then you're going to have individuals who show up and don't tune in. So I think you have to measure growth in this culture with having both and then some more. I think whatever vehicles that your church uses to get the word out, the message out, those are the platforms that you have to identify with. If you were accustomed to seeing 100 kids and you have, 45 on social media platform and 60 or 55, in the seat, I think that's a good measuring tool. You may be missing some individuals, but they're actually online. And what I've seen is that a lot of youth ministries are not modeling both. They're being pushed to model bringing kids to the building, and they're not necessarily being pushed to model both and.
That's an interesting statement that they're saying that both and is beneficial, so that there is these, butts in seats, but also eyes on screen. Yeah. So how do we as youth pastors communicate how do we create quality communication with our pastor? Like we know a lot of youth pastors like, yo, man, look, all our kids are online. They're in service. Listen, I was talking to someone the other day. I was like, if you told me you didn't use your phone in church, you a lie. We all pulling our phones out at some point during service, checking our Instagram or checking our bank account. Somebody, you checking something. Mm-hmm. We realize that online is where it's at, but how do we create quality communication with our pastor? How do we initiate, man, I want to talk to you about something?
I think first it starts with relationship. I think you have to develop relationship, right? And you have to, in my opinion, help your pastor to appreciate that you're not a hireling, that you're not here as a stepping stone to something else. I think in the culture that I grew up in, many youth ministers came into youth ministry as a stepping stone to senior pastorate. And so a lot of pastors already had a level of frustration or a level of concern when they would hire in, especially young men would hire them in as youth pastors. There was a level of concern there that these young guys are coming in and I know they're not going to be with us long. It's a stepping stone. I think secondly, you have to develop active listening. Your pastor has to know that you can accept feedback. You're actively engaged with some of the opinions and ideas that he may potentially have. And then you have to actively show him that you're engaged in conversation when he is giving feedback. Take notes, ask for elaboration. I think a second thing that's important is transparency. Be transparent with as much as possible with your senior pastor. I think transparency is the key to developing quality relationships. If I feel like I can't trust you when we're having open dialogue about ministry or anything else when we're talking, and I don't feel like you're candid or even transparent, then it's going to be really hard for me to relate and communicate heavy, honest details about a particular thing. Because, again, as a senior pastor, we don't have all the answers. And so if I know that I can be transparent with you and you can be transparent with me, that again is the foundation for developing quality relationships. Then another thing I think important about communicating with your senior pastor is clarity. I think you got to be clear about goals, clear about what your expectations are. Refer back to that job description that they gave you when you got hired. Duties and responsibilities. You got to be honest enough with yourself and them about clarifying what terms mean in that job description, because obviously that job description outlines for you in any quality church what those expectations are, the objectives, the goals, clarify those things. And if you're not clear, seek to have a meeting with that senior pastor to clarify what's in my job description. I think, as a senior pastor, I think the struggle always is clarity. What my expectations are over and above those job descriptions, because obviously those job descriptions keep shifting. They're nascent. They're always becoming, right? We didn't see COVID coming. And so when COVID came, a lot of your job descriptions needed to be redefined. And I think as a youth pastor, when you hit the wall, you got to be clear and be like, hey, listen, if I can call it the adult church or the church beyond the youth has had to make a shift, and you're constantly having conversations and elaborating about that shift. What's the plan for youth ministry? Where do you want us to land in this shift? I think all of those things are important and strategic in developing a youth ministry and developing dialogue. I also think you got to have the ability to ask open-ended questions, right? I think that you have to have a relationship established enough where you can go into a closed door meeting with your senior pastor and ask closing questions that you can't put on the table in a staff meeting, questions that you cannot communicate among other youth workers. It has to be between you and your pastor, and get honest answers and honest feedback on that. Things like saying, hey, pastor, okay, you said this. Can you tell me more about that? Pastor, hey, can you explain what you mean, or the email that was sent to me, about what needed to happen? Can you define that term for me? Can you define that concept for me? And then I think the other thing too about real honest assessment, in communication with your senior pastor, has to be a level of empathy, right? I think there has to be empathy on both sides. I think you have to be empathetic with your senior pastor's plight, but he also has to be empathetic with your plight. You have to be empathetic with the level of stress and pressure that is on his shoulders to manage and strategically manage a church and grow it and create disciples. But he or she also has to be empathetic with you in terms of what you're trying to do under that umbrella, if you will. I think body language is important, right? Because if I'm in a meeting with the youth pastor, and I see my youth pastor was on a few seconds ago, but my youth pastor and his body language is bad when we're having a conversation. Like, yeah, let's hurry up and get this over with. Or he seems to be preoccupied with another thought that has nothing to do with this meeting that we called. and I immediately feel some sense of frustration or angst that he's not listening. And so if I feel like he's not listening, if we're having a conversation, and incidentally, that has never happened, but if I feel like he's not listening and he's making me to feel like this conversation is boring to him, sometimes it could take the conversation a different direction for a senior pastor. It's like, hey, your body language is so bad that what I'm saying, you're not actively listening, if I could use that term. Your eyes are not bright. You're not making good eye contact. You're looking down. You're on your phone. You're touching your watch. You're not writing notes. All those things can stress out a senior leader in feeling like the feedback that I am giving you is not important to you. And then the other thing, too, I think that's really important, the last one about good communication for me, is when you receive the feedback. Senior pastors want to see that you implemented something. If we constantly are meeting and I could never see visibly that you implemented something we talked about, then in my mind, it was a moot point. You wasted my time. You galvanized my time, if you will, or quarantined my time, if you will. And you never implement anything that we talked about. So I think those things potentially can help develop better communication and relationships with senior pastors.
Those are some fire answers. I think I learned a new word, nascent. So trust me, I will be using that word later. I loved the asking for a meeting, transparent, honest. Those things really stood out to me. And empathy, body language, you don't really think about, they see that you might be checked out, so they're going to check out of the conversation. But, let's see, before we were able to get the conversation, sometimes I believe youth pastors have a unspoken fear of actually even talking to their senior pastor. Like, if I talk to them, they probably won't care what I have to say anyway, so I'll just won't say anything at all. Or they feel like the youth ministry is just just something to keep the kids busy. Mm-hmm. How do we as youth pastors emphasize the necessity, or even to prioritize, like, we're more than babysitters?
Right. I think, again, in that active dialogue that you have with the senior pastor, I think it all goes back to the initial job description and what the expectations were in the initial interview. You can hold your senior pastor to some level of accountability based upon that job description. And many youth pastors don't have written job descriptions, or when those job descriptions shift, make sure you get it in writing, because one of the things or the places that I know about a youth pastor in that position, because when I served in it, the job description is always shifting. Initially you come in and your responsibility is youth worship, a Bible study, summer activities. Then it turns into, now we want you to be the summer camp guy. Now we want you to be, when we have this event going on, we want you to open up the youth area, and we want to, that's when it becomes the babysitter, right? And we need to have so many youth workers there because this is going to be a major event, and we need you guys to coordinate with the parents and have something available. And you get this call 3 days before the event, because in the initial planning, the kids weren't factored in. So, all of those things happen all the time, and those transitions happen all the time. And I think it's really important that as a youth pastor, youth leader, that you have open dialogue to talk about those objectives and those goals, especially when you're asked to do something beyond the objective and goals that were initially given to you. And it becomes incumbent upon you as the youth pastor to either renegotiate what those objective and goals ought to look like, or at least to bring it back to the meeting and say, hey, just an FYI, pastor, initially you guys, or you asked me to lead in this way and do this particular thing. I'm noticing that has shifted some. Is there anything in the mission and the vision that you have for youth ministry here at New Faith Church? Has it shifted? And if it's shifted, I would love to have a conversation with you about how I can more adequately and feasibly meet those needs. Those are the kind of conversations you got to have. Go ahead.
I like that. There's I guess on Instagram or TikTok, there's this meme going around where it's like, speak up. Right. Yeah. And I think we have to, because what happens is we get new job descriptions thrust upon us. Some youth pastors became digital graphic communicator, videographers, and they did it during the pandemic. And then after the pandemic, they're also all these other jobs that they didn't take on and never go back to their senior pastor or their supervisor or their leader to say, hey, hold on now. Yeah. And so you're unnecessarily carrying weight when that's not what you were meant to do. But before you even have that conversation, I look Ephesians 6. What verse is it? It's like 10. He says, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. I think that we can have strong armor and have weak soldiers. Yep. And so you have to not only know that you have the opportunity to go speak to your senior pastor, but you got to go do it.
You got to go do it.
You got to go do it. Like, you can put on the armor, but if you don't go to war.
Well, let's even dig deeper. Let's be honest. I think in a more honest, candid discussion, some of that anxiety, and I've been there, is because you know that you're not doing what you're supposed to do. See, that's the other part, is that I can't go to you knowing that I'm lacking in other areas, because I don't want the light to be shined. See, the problem I'm having is dark in this one corner, but if you shine the light anywhere else, there's going to be another issue that I'm going to have to deal with. It may be kids are not showing up. I'm not sending text messages. I'm not building relationships. I'm not visiting the schools. I'm not going to games. I'm not communicating with kids. I'm not developing those lasting relationships that make me a part of the life of that student, and help me to make them a better disciple, or being able to disciple them. And so as a result of that, I'm avoiding the conversation because, I don't like what you're doing here. But if I bring this up, the potential of what I didn't do may potentially come up, and I don't have an answer for that. That's the other part of this. I've been there. I know as a youth pastor that sometimes the last event I had failed miserably. And the 2 weeks later, they put this other thing on me. Pastor hasn't said anything. If I bring this up, I'm afraid that they're going to shine the spotlight on what I didn't do. That's a reality.
Yeah, I like that. I tell the teenagers of the church here, if you don't like your check, review your hours. Yeah, it really gets down to like before you, and then even if you start complaining about what you're not getting paid, what are you doing in the areas where you're actually getting paid to do? Yeah, and understanding the full dynamics of everything that's going on. Question, here's another one. We talk about being active and doing things. There's a good gentleman on here, John, talks about the value of networking with other youth pastors to help impact their local schools without appearing to be absent from their local church as an employee. What is the value of being in collaborative communities or connecting with other youth pastors as opposed to just, hey, I'm here for my church, my ministry, my youth department?
Yeah. So, back in my season, you and I collaborated quite a bit. Collaboration, I think, is important. But I think, again, reviewable hours, because, reviewable hours, if your work schedule is 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday, and 9 to 12 on Friday, let's say, because Sunday is considered a work day, right? Or you're off on Mondays and you work Tuesday through Friday, whatever that looks like. As a pastor, my expectation is that you would visit the school once or twice a week. But let's be real. The movements of culture, shoot the armed shooters in schools, they're kind of focused on who's coming in those schools and how long they're staying, right? So much of what you do is either going to be during a lunch hour, it's going to be maybe a potential visit for a teacher who may have gotten you a pass to come in, maybe speak to the football team, the basketball team. You're not there 9 to 4, right? There's no need for you to be there 9 to 4 because they're taking instruction. So viably visiting a school for me is actively being present as either a hall monitor, influencing some level of trust between the school and your local church, being active in some of the events that they have, being a viable resource, being that go-between between that principal, that school, and your pastor and the resources that your church can provide. That's, in my opinion, is the responsibility of the youth pastor. But to stay there indefinitely and say, I'm going there Monday through Friday, to me, you're wasting time. I think you can put forth more effort by developing relationships and seeing how you could connect with various events within the school. Hopefully I answered the question, but
I think you did. And the point is that there is value, right? There's value in getting out there and being more than just present in there. But I think John said it right here. He's talking about is showing where your time is going, time reports.
Yes. Yeah.
What does it look like for a youth pastor? Post where you're at. Take a picture. Share that you've done some things. We're in a sight and sound generation. And unfortunately, you can be active in the community and doing things, but if the membership doesn't see it, if your pastor doesn't see it, it's just, we're going off of your good word, which I'm not saying your word isn't good, but pictures tell a lot.
Well, it's I forget the saying, but it's a saying about, trust but verify, right?
Ooh, that's it.
Yeah. And so ultimately, as a senior pastor, I trust you, but it doesn't hurt to verify, your intent. I've been at so-and-so and so-and-so this week. I was at the school so many hours this week. And again, credible hours, not just walking around the campus, credible hours, because I've done that. I've been 20 something years old, going to the school, just hanging around Madison High School, because at that time, Madison was the school that I was at. Just running, walking around the hallways, speaking to everybody, nothing necessarily credible other than just being visible. Nothing was going on. So in my opinion, in this season, if you're going to go to the schools, make sure you're going to the school with a purpose. What's the intent of you going there? What event can you be actively engaged in that gets your church, your ministry actively involved in some level of discipleship that you can take from the school to the church to the community at the end of the day?
That's good. That's good. Like you're not just hanging around out there, because there are some that's like, well, I'm here. I'm like, what'd you do? And there's something, there is the gospel, and I won't say the gospel, but there's it's called the something of presence. But yes, there's something about just being there. But more than just being there, be involved.
Be involved.
So let's see. I'm going to see if there's any questions. We're going to wrap this thing up here. But if there are any questions, put it in the chat or unmute. Come on live. Let me see your face. Ask a question. We have Dr. Lewis here. Listen, I'm telling you, this guy is a wealth of knowledge. Not only does he care about ministry, but he actually trains pastors in doing the work that he does, so that they are not just in I don't know how to put it, but they. Look, you're already getting shout out. Somehow that's my senior pastor. Look. But he's a pastor of pastors, which is amazing. So are there any questions? Throw them out now. Come on live or throw a question out there. I will say this. What is your best advice? You served as a senior pastor, you served as a youth pastor in different types of ministries. What would you say is your best advice to a youth pastor that is just jumping into the ministry? There was a book written several years ago called Your First 2 Years in Youth Ministry. What is your best advice to someone who's just getting into youth ministry first year?
I would think that they need to journal their personal pilgrimage, right? And yeah, they got to journal their personal pilgrimage, and then shaping their or knowing their own identity in youth ministry, because that is going to change. Think about when I got started in my 20s. I'm 49 today. When I got started in my 20s, when I transitioned out of youth ministry, I started at 21. When I transitioned out, I was 36. So when I transitioned out of youth ministry, I was a father of 4. So what was important to me as a young youth pastor, then one who had 4 kids, things started changing for me. I identified differently. The joking and the playing and what I came into youth ministry as, and, the fun days going to the youth events and putting powder on the kid's face and, all of those things like that we didn't really think about when we were doing it. Well, now when I started getting older, you start thinking about, if I put too much powder, they may not breathe. They might die. They might, you start thinking about all kinds of things that you didn't think about when you're in your 20s, because that's that level of maturity. And as you journal, it helps you to see your own pilgrimage. I think the second thing is identifying what the objectives and the goals of that ministry or that senior pastor. What does he have? What does he expect out of ministry? Not you, but out of ministry at that particular level. What does he want to see? I think those things are really important. Identifying who's on your team. Team players, who are the major team players when you come in the door, especially if it's not an upstart, or who are the major team players, who are the major mover and shakers, right? I think, there's a lot of individual work that has to be done, self-empowerment, balance, understanding, your leverage, your relationships, all of the things that are necessary as a young youth pastor or youth pastor coming in the door. Those things I think are vital. Knowing the church culture. What's the culture of that church? What's the context, the surrounding that church, the culture, the community? What are you coming into? Is it a commuter church? Nobody lives in the community. Is it a church full of community-minded people who are part of that community, have lived in that community? I think all of those things are important, because when I came to New Faith, nobody lived in the community. All of my kids lived out in Siena, out in Missouri City, out in Fresno. We're in Hiram Clark. None of my parishioners lived there. So doing urban ministry, I really wasn't doing urban ministry. I had kids went to Clements, went to Bel Air, so none of those kids were actively engaged in urban living. And so as a result, their parents were making 6 figures. So I think all of those things are important when you start developing context, is knowing what context you're coming into.
Those are solid answers. I really liked knowing the culture and the context of your ministry. Because you could come in thinking you're serving a certain people group, and you're wondering why they're not showing up on a Thursday night for an event when they don't live anywhere near the school or near the church. And like I look at where your church is, even compared to ours, we're in a food desert. We're in an entertainment desert. So if I do an event at the church and there's nothing for the parents to do, the chances of them bringing the kids are pretty low, because they're like, well, what am I do for 2 hours while my kid is with you? Right. So understanding what are the dynamics of the ministry. We got a question out there. We got Mr. Jason Brown, who, listen, I think Jay Brown. This is a solid preacher, man. This guy was at Lily Grove, and now he's serving really well at Harvest Point. Man, Pastor Brown, come on and ask your question.
First off, it ain't Pastor, so we're not going to play these games tonight. I'm going to behave because we're recording. Dr. Lewis, good to see you. Pastor Cumbie, good to see you guys. I did have a question, and listening to your most recent answer, and Comby, this connects to a discussion that we had maybe last week. Doc, I'm gonna be 47 next year.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that connected Will and I and a group of guys that we spent a lot of time with while I was full time is that we were just youth guys. Mm-hmm. None of us, and even these guys that we still connect with today, none of us were looking to become senior pastors. You know, that was not, and maybe even to this day has not been, at least nobody's revealed it, the call on our life from God. It's just, but we're youth guys. So we would, you know, be in meetings, collaborating, and kind of, I openly giggle at some of the guys that were with us because we know they were using youth ministry as a stepping stone. Mm-hmm. Evident in the way that they manage their ministries, right? Mm-hmm. Preacher practice, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. But as I'm aging, and this is just a conversation that Will and I had, you know, what would you have to say as brothers who are getting older? Mm-hmm. Pretty soon we're going to be the corny guys. Well, I'm already the corny guy, you know. But you know, we have the ability to develop relationships, and of course, we are youth guys. But what is there to be said for aging people in youth ministry from your experience and your opinion? And I'll mute and listen.
Okay. So I think that's a very relevant question, Jason, and I appreciate you asking that, because I think it's essential. It's important for this season in the life of the church and even the life of individuals who've served in ministry for a long period of time. You know, one of the things that I think a aging senior youth leader has to start processing, who's in leadership, is drive, tenacity. Do I still have those things for the ministry? Am I still relevant? Relevance is important. Am I even still relevant? Because, you know, to be the senior aging guy or woman who is doing youth ministry and still wearing your hat to the back, still wearing the holy jeans, still wearing the tight T-shirt, still wearing the muscle shirt, still trying to identify with a group that you no longer identify with. Your kids are their age now, and you no longer have the zeal to be at basketball games 4 or 5 times a week, football games 5-6 times a week, because your kids are playing now. I think one seriously has to start thinking about transitioning out, discipling someone else who will have the zeal and the energy to maintain youth ministry at the level you did when you were their age. I think there's nothing wrong with transitioning to something else. I think the problem is many youth ministry leaders stay too long. And what ends up happening is when they start getting depleted in energy, the youth ministry starts to look like it. They're not creating new ministry leaders. They're not developing people who can take their place. I remember one of the going mottos, and Jason and Will, you may remember this. One of the models that was going on back in the 90s was you needed to disciple someone or disciple yourself out of a job. That was the going theme during that in the 90s. Well, many of us discipled people, but we didn't disciple people out of a job. We didn't make enough leaders so that the ministry was heavy leader oriented by people who grew up in the ministry. And so what ends up happening is that we're still running things in key and critical areas where youth should be running, where high school graduates or high school or college graduates who came up out of that ministry who have a desire to come back or give back to that ministry would come back and potentially participate. We didn't recreate ourselves. And I think that's another issue that we ran into. We did not reduplicate ourselves. We helped those kids grow and disciple them, but we didn't give them the zeal to come back. We didn't give them the zeal to want to take over. And I think all of those things are credible. But I do think when you start getting older and you no longer have the zeal for it, you have a passion for seeing young people grow, but you don't have the zeal for the work, the administrative work, the office work, the going to the games, the phone calls, if the kid got in trouble at school, you having the 30-minute conversations when the parent calls you panicking with anxiety. Can you talk to my baby after church when you're ready to go home and eat? And, all of those things that happen, that's a part of youth ministry. If you no longer have the zeal for that, I think you have to start transitioning out and be honest enough with yourself and your family and your senior pastor that, hey, I think it's time for me to start transitioning out. I think it's time for me to start making credible moves, to start moving and doing something else that God is leading me to. Woe to the youth pastor who's in their 60s still being a youth pastor. I think that season is gone in our church. Yeah.
That's good. And that's a hard thing for some youth pastors who love it, but realize, hey, this is getting a little more difficult.
Yeah.
I know for me, I can stay up at 21, but now we do lock-ins. It's like, all right, now we turn the lights out. It's midnight. Y'all need to lay down somewhere because I'm tired.
Yeah,
but, I mean, it's a hard question. And you're right. I think, and I will have to come back to this at a later time, but how do we share with other young adults like, hey, this job is worth having?
That's right.
Because what they're seeing is, why would I want your job? You never home, you tired, your kids don't see you anymore, and you're telling me you want me to do what you do?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think there has to be some thought in when you do it, you don't do it too late. When you are looking horrible and you go, hey, you want this? No, I don't want that.
Well, the other thing too is when I first started doing youth ministry, the average tenure of a youth pastor was up to 3 years. Mm-hmm. They didn't make it. And three things were happening. They either got fired, they either lost their families, or they quit and never went back to youth ministry or ministry, period. Mm-hmm. Those are the three things going on in the 90s. And so the reality is that youth pastoring is a hard job because you have to balance your time differently. But as your family expands, because most senior pastors have an expectation for you to connect with the kids, not when they come to church, but connect with them beyond the church. That takes a fortitude, a mindset that sometimes pulls on your family life differently and the expectation level, which means that you have to now balance time at home, balance time at work, and balance time with that kid or those kids in a different way, which means that it's going to take a different set of energy, if you will, than you didn't have before. And so I think, again, the other piece that I want to add, Will, is you said that, we got to make youth ministry work attractional. We don't make it attractional to other youth people because they see us and they're like, just like you said, no, I don't want to do that. Because we don't make it attractional. I don't want to do that. You're never at home. It wasn't until I was a assistant pastor that kids that grew up with me at New Faith who started having their own families would see me, who I'm now doing premarital counsel for, married, christened their kids. And they're saying to me, I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you was at every game. I don't know how you was at every event. I don't know how you came to my volleyball game. I don't know how you went to the track meets, and I know you used to drag your son along. I don't think I would be able to do that. I know Ashley was with you all the time. I don't know how I'd be able to do that because it doesn't look attractional. And when I look back over my life, I think about all of the things that I missed because I was trying to be super youth pastor. So I think going back to our original conversation, there has to be honest dialogue between the senior pastor and the youth pastor about what expectations you have. And the youth pastor has to be honest enough about what he can or she can do credibly that doesn't damage their family. Can't hear you.
There we go. Man, that Zoom protocol. I'm already talking with my mute on. Boy, terrible. Okay, so we got one more question. I think we got time for the last one. We have Miss Kendra Hudson. I'm going to bring her on. She's got a good question. Kendra, you are now live. What is your question?
Good evening. The question that I have is really to encourage someone who may want to be a youth minister or who's in youth ministry. So, Pastor Lewis, question would be, we see that you've made it and were successful as a youth pastor. The question that I have is, as a youth pastor, what was, I would say, the worst mistake that you think you made? What did you learn from it? And then also, what was the most joyful thing that you found in being a pastor?
Okay. Well, the first mistake, I think probably the most troubling mistake that I made as a youth pastor was lack of balance. As I said early on, I had 4 kids, and all of my kids required their father's time. And my wife, was a beautician. So she worked late nights. So anything I did, I had to take the kids with me. And sometimes they suffered with having personal one-on-one time with me because I was having to be visible for the church. So at the cost of my family or my kids, there were seasons where the kids missed out because I had to be at the church. There were seasons where the kids missed out because I had to be at an event. My son may have had a football game or a basketball game. My daughter may have had a track meet, but I had to go do a lock-in, or I had to go speak in an event, or I had to go see so-and-so's child who got locked up, or, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so I think the lack of balance was damaging to my first 2 kids and maybe a little bit to my third. But when I finally got the hang of this thing, I recognized that I needed to make a transition there and make an adjustment. And then I do remember when my daughter Ashley probably was about 7, I was leaving for a youth event, a youth retreat, and it was high schoolers. And so she was too young to go. And I was leaving one day and she came down and met me at the stairs and she said, "Dad, you're leaving again?" And it took me a minute to process that. And so all of their life, they kept seeing me going, so you have to really start processing that. So that was the biggest mistake I think I made. The greatest joy, success that I've had is seeing youth who are now young adults, 30, 31 years old, who 28, 27, who graduated college or worked some technical job, and they're still connected to the church. They're bringing their families there. That's been my greatest joy, having the opportunity to know that I played a part in investing in that kid. And let me be clear, any level of success that any of us have, there are going to be some sacrifices. Any level of success you desire to have in ministry, there's going to be some denying yourself. There's going to be some picking up your cross, and there's going to be some following him. And I think all 3 of those are constantly working themselves out in our individual and personal ministries.
Listen, this is good. This is, I hope people are paying attention. I think probably I have a page full of notes over here, but I think the ones that stand out to me are when you receive instruction, implement. That's like that one landed pretty heavy. Journal your personal pilgrimage. I like that because if you aren't writing down where you are, but also as you are progressing and moving forward, you can look back and see what you've done and what went well and what didn't went well. You can see where you can do better. Then the other one, what'd you say? I like this one. You have to have honest dialogue about expectation. Mm-hmm. When we are quiet, I told my wife this the other day, expectation without communication is chaos. Mm-hmm. And if we're not talking about it and I'm not meeting your expectation, I don't know why you mad. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the same way you walk around mad at your senior pastor because he has expectations when you never told him, hey, this is more than I can handle. Mm-hmm. You know, heroes are in movies, right? Like you're a human. Heroes are from movies. Be a human and say, honestly, hey, this is too much.
Yeah.
I need help, or hey, here's where we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to be honest, I think that that's a big thing when it comes to youth ministry is have that time and be dogmatic about having that conversation with your pastor. We get it. Everybody's busy. Go through the assistant. Make the appointment. Do the work to make the appointment. Send the text message. Hey, P, listen, I just need 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. And share your chat, because here's the other thing too. As a senior pastor, we have stresses, and there's one, we are big vision oriented. Mm-hmm. When I was a youth pastor or executive pastor, my job or responsibility was pay attention to the details. Mm-hmm. When you have a conversation with your senior pastor, master the 3-minute conversation. You don't want to take, if he gives you more time or she gives you more time, that's one thing. Master bulleting and being so good at the bullet format that whatever you said in the bullet format makes them desire to have more dialogue. But I think when you initially have that conversation, you're going to have to master the bullet format to some degree. You're going to have to master that. The 3-minute conversation.
I like that. Come prepared. I know even with our chief operating officer here at the church, if I walk into his office and I'm not prepared and he asks me, hey, where are we at on this? And I only have answers up so far. I got to go out of his office, and as busy as he is, I may not meet with him for another day.
Yeah.
So if I want to get my event approved, I need to know I went to 3 different vendors. Here are the costs that I got from the 3 vendors. Here's where I'm going to do it. Here's the time I'm going to do it. Because everybody's busy. And if you want to get your stuff approved, make sure you've done the work. And I think the other thing that I liked you said was, before you complain about what they aren't doing, make sure you're doing what they've called you to do.
That's right.
Before you complain about what they aren't doing for you, make sure you're doing what they asked you to do in the first place.
That's right.
That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Our guy, Willie Kelly, he's one of our leaders here. He says, if it were not for DeVuley, I would not have learned about balance. That's one of the reasons why formal training is needed in youth ministry, right? You got to have that training, because a lot of youth pastors are just people that love working with kids. They got picked to work with kids.
Yeah.
And so it's important that you get the PD, or professional development.
Yeah. I went through DeVuley in 2002, and I remember going through that DeVos Urban Initiative and getting that training and coming back all excited. And, I'm going to implement this, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be a part of this. I think formal training is essential to youth ministry, but I also think that you have to determine, do you want to be a professional youth pastor or you want to be a transitional youth pastor? There's a difference. Professional youth pastors take the time to learn, develop, connect, leverage relationships, go to conferences, find classes, sit under the mentorship or the tutelage of someone who's done it longer than them, who's successful. There's a mental model of someone out there that's doing ministry at the level you want to do it at. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have somebody if you're the guru now and there's nobody that's over you that you're looking at as your mental picture or model, that's a problem. And then secondly, if you're not going to be a professional youth pastor, and again, that means getting academic credentials. That means managing your networks, and again, getting the conferences under your belt, 2 or 3 a year. You're reading books outside of church books, Christian books. If you're going to be a transitional youth pastor, that means you're going to be there 1 to 3 years. So if you're going to be there 1 to 3 years, and transitional for me is bivocational as well, meaning that you're serving, but you also have a full-time job. That means that you're limited on the amount of time that you can give to that youth ministry. If that's the case, you're going to have to build a credible team of individuals who have certain skill sets that can meet the need. And now you guys are working as an organization that's meeting the needs of the job description that was initially given to you.
That's good.
If I could speak right there on that, Pastor Lewis, I'm sorry, I'm with my family, and that's why I'm not on screen. Thank you so much for your commentary thus far. I've been listening attentively. You said something that was key. You said that structure, building a team and working as an organization. I think a lot of youth pastors have a love for kids, but lack that structure. And I think that's kind of what I was speaking to when I was talking about formal training in youth ministry. It takes more than just a love for kids to go and efficiently and effectively oversee a youth ministry, especially when you're under the leadership of that pastor, and that pastor has a vision. If the pastor gives you that vision, you're expected to run with it, but you have to have those tools to be able to do that. And that's what I was speaking to. And I can tell that you definitely understand that you've done it for years. Now, as a senior pastor as well, you know how necessary structure is. So yeah, I just comment on that. Yes, sir.
And you learn, and I appreciate that, Bro Kelly. One of the things that you learn very quickly too, and just like you as a youth pastor, you learn very quickly when things aren't right. When the person is filibustering. When they have not organized the ministry well. And because I've done it for so long, if my youth pastor comes to me and I start asking questions, let's just say about what happened, why it wasn't successful, or how do you think it went? Or, we spent $5,000 and 60 kids showed up, or 40 kids showed up, and we anticipated in the methodology 300 kids. Well, immediately I know somebody dropped the ball with communication. That's the first thing. Second thing, I know somebody dropped the ball with advertising. Thirdly, somebody created a ministry activity without learning or developing capacity. What can we actually do with who we have? So you spent money on the big picture, which was $5,000 on 400 kids you said were going to come in your methodology, but you didn't take the time to actively look at who was actually coming to ministry events prior to this event. So that creates a level of tension for any senior pastor who has a knowledge of how organizational budgets work. So, and like me, I know immediately if you spent this amount of money and you said you were going to spend on these many kids, well, I already know that you're wasting money because you didn't do the research or the legwork. Here's the other part. In this culture, you can't buy hot dogs. I'm going to give you something basic because kids talking about glizzies, right? So you already know that at a youth event, if you buy 100 hot dogs, at least 90 of them going to sit down and never be touched. Right? So you just wasted the church's money on 100 hot dogs because you didn't know your context. You see how that works? Yeah. So as a senior pastor, I'm irritated because I got to tell you context, but you're working in it.
Uh-oh.
You see what I'm saying?
Uh-oh. Yeah.
So that creates a problem for a senior pastor.
That was number 4. Know the culture and the context. That's number 4 on the points.
Yeah, your kids don't eat hot dogs. They eat pizzas.
Yeah.
They don't like nachos. They want pizza. So know your context. So now you're not even being a good steward of the resources that were given you for that financial year. So the next year when you're less $5,000 and you're upset, they're not supporting my ministry. They ain't helping. No. Go back to last year when you wasted $5,000. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And if you don't understand that dynamic, I'm looking at y'all. Y'all are getting seasoned in age like me. So y'all understand where I'm coming from. So, but at 21, 25, 26, 30, you don't understand that.
No, you tell your kids, oh, you want another pair of Jordans? Let's talk about the ones scuffed up.
That's all I'm saying
right now.
You won't take care of the ones you have. So that's all part of the transition of getting older in ministry. Your maturity level makes you look at things differently.
Facts.
And that's why I think every youth pastor should have a senior mentor, someone who's walking with them in youth ministry, who has done it, who's been a part of it. And you're not going to them to, oh my God, they're not supporting me. No, you going to them to be honest with you about what you're not doing.
That's good. Man,
yeah.
Well, on that note, we have exhausted our hour. We've had a great discussion. I really like that last point. You have a senior leader, someone that you can talk to. Over and over in scripture, it talks about having that you are subject to someone. I even look at the story of Jesus, right? When he was, when they found him, he said, and he was subject to them. And so I just encourage you all, man, find someone you can speak to. We have a network here in Houston called the Overflow Fuel Network, where that's what it is. It's a bunch of leaders in different areas and levels of ministry, and it's conversation. Ministry should not be done alone.